Hello friends, you welcome to my complete Java course. In today's video lecture, we are going to learn final keywords in Java. So let's start. Final keyword in Java. Java final keyword can be applied on variable, final method and final class. So what is the usage and what is the significance to use the final keywords on variable, on methods, on the classes? So what is the final variable? Java final variable. We should initialize a final variable in Java. Otherwise a compiler can throw a compile time error. A Java final variable will only initialize once, either via an initializer or via constructor. So if you define a final variable, you need to compulsory initialize it. Otherwise, compiler can throw the compile time error. You can initialize a final variable within the constructor or within the instance initializer block. And final variable can be initialized only once. If you try to initialize final variable again, it will throw the error. There are three ways to initialize a Java final variable. Number one, you can initialize a final variable when it is declared. This approach is the most common approach. When you declare the final variable, you initialize that final variable at that time. Number two, a blank final variable is initialized within the instance initializer block or within a constructor. Number three is a final static variable is initialized within a static block. And we have learned the instance initializer block and the static block in my previous video. If you don't know what is the static block and what is the instance initializer block, just go to my previous videos and watch that videos first and then watch this video. Only then you will understand what is the instance initializer block and the static block. So when to use a final variable in Java? The only difference between a normal variable and a final variable is that we will reassign value to a normal variable. However, we cannot change the value of a final variable once assigned. Therefore, Java final variables must be used for the values that we would like to keep constant throughout the execution of a program. It means in your program, if any value is not changing even a one time, then define that value as a final. Once a variable is initialized as final, we cannot reassign the value to it. So let's show you an example. Here we define a class final variable, and in that class we define a final property, final int number, and we initialize the value 90. And we create a run method. In the run method, we are initializing the number again with the 400. So once you try to reassign the value, output will be compile time error. Here we create the object for the class and calling the run method. Compile time error. So because once a variable is initialized as a final, we cannot reassign the value to it. Okay, so let's show you this example on Eclipse IDE. So just let's see. I just copy and paste the code from this slide. So here we create a number and initialize the value with 90, and in the run method we are initializing the final variable. So it is showing the error here. remove final modifier of number. It is giving a warning, but if you run this program, you will get a compile time error. Unresolved compilation problem. The number cannot be assigned. Why number cannot be assigned? Because number is a final. If you remove the final from here, you can happily reassign the value. And if you run this, program will run without error. Now the next point is final class in Java. What is final class in Java? It means if you define a class as a final. So we cannot create a subclass to the class, or we cannot extend a class, or we cannot modify a class which is declared as final. If you define a class as a final, then you cannot create the subclass for that class, or you cannot extend that class, or you cannot modify that class. Suppose take an example. If you take a final class and if you try to extend that final class, you will get the compile time error, because if you define a class as a final, you cannot create its subclass. Next one is final method in Java. We cannot override a method, or we cannot modify a method in the subclass which is declared as final in the superclass. If you define a method as a final in the superclass and you want to override that method in the subclass, you cannot do, because final method is never ever overridden. What is override method? We learn in the inheritance. When we learn the inheritance concept, that time we cover the what is the method overriding and method overloading. So basically here is one example. Here we create a class name with superclass, give a method with a final keyword final void method1 in the parent class. Now if we extend this superclass and we try to give the implementation of subclass for the same method, so this is called the overridden method. So here you are overriding the method, so you will get the compile time error. Why you will get the compile time error? Because you cannot be override the final method. So now we will talk about the 10 important points for the final keywords. So number 1 is any class or any method can be either abstract or final, but not both. Abstract and final are totally opposite, because abstract class or abstract method must be implemented or modified in the subclass, but final does not allow this. In the abstract class and the interface, we define the abstract method. Why we define the abstract method? We define the abstract method so that in the child class or in the subclass we can provide the body for that abstract method. But for the final method, we cannot give the body in the subclass. That's why the abstract and final keyword we cannot use together, because this is the wrong combination of abstract and final. Abstract means you need to give the body, or you need to override. Compulsory you need to override. And final means compulsory you should not override. That is why they are the opposite keyword. Number 2. Final variable cannot be re-initialized, but final variable can be used to initialize other variables. Means if you define a variable like here we define a variable int I equal to 10. Okay, so now we cannot even increment the value, because increment means we are initializing the value, but we can use to initialize the other value. Like here we define a other variable j, and this j variable can be assigned by the I. So final variable can be used to initialize other variables, and if you will print it, the final variable can be used. So let's I show you on the Eclipse IDE. So suppose here we create a final variable and we initialize it. If we try to initialize it again, like we create a method public void m1, okay, and in this m1 we try to number equal to 60, you will get a compile time error. Okay, but if you define any other variable like int count, this count variable can be initialized by this final variable. So here is showing the error. Why? Because it is saying final variable cannot be assigned again. But that final variable can be used to assign any other variable. Okay. Now number 3 point is final method can be overloaded, and that overloaded method can be overridden in the subclass. Overloaded means if you define same name method more than one time in the Java class, that is called the overloaded method. But in the overloaded method, the parameter or the argument is always different. The method overloading concept we learn in the inheritance in the detail. Okay, so first we can overload the final method. Suppose we have a class superclass. In that superclass, we can create a final method, final void method 1. In the same class, we can create another one method with the same name method 1, and but the parameter should be different. So here we are passing one parameter, here we did not pass any parameter. Here we create a final method, here we remove the final keyword. So these methods are the overloaded. So we can say that we can overload the final method. Okay, but final method cannot be override. It means if you create its subclass, and if you try to override that method, which is like method 1, so it will not allow. So overloading is possible, but overriding is not possible by the final method.